All right, in this lesson we're going to be looking at how to solve some different types of equations and inequalities. Let's start with this first type of problem. So we're going to first look at how to solve equations involving fractions. Anytime we have equations involving fractions, you want to make sure that you clear the fractions by multiplying by the least common denominator. Make sure you get that in your notes, because that is something that you're going to be required to know, and you're going to be required to know how to do as you take your test and work on some of these problems. So make sure you get this in your notes. All right, so what does that mean? Well, when you look at this first equation, we have x minus 2 divided by 4 plus x divided by 3 equals 10. My denominators are 4 and 3. So I want to find the least common denominator that both 4 and 3 will divide into evenly. And that would be 12. So I'm going to multiply the everything, not just the first fraction, not just the second fraction, but everything, I'm going to multiply by 12. Now how does that work? Each of these are terms. Like this is a term, this is a term, and that's a term. So as I work with each of those terms, I'm going to use 12 with each of them. So in the first term there, x minus 2 divided by 4, well, how many times does 4 go into 12? Well, it goes into 12 3 times. So we'll be left with 3 times the numerator, x minus 2. And then we look at the next one. How many times does 3 go into 12? Well, 3 goes into 12 4 times. We'll be left with 4 to multiply that numerator by, which is just x. And for the last one, there's nothing to divide 12 by, so in the last one, we're going to have equals 12 times 10. And now I'm just going to simplify this, so I distribute the 3 through. And so when you do that, we would get 3x minus 6 plus 4x equals 120. And now we're just going to combine like terms. So 3x and 4x, they're on the same side of the equation, so we're not going to subtract 4x from both sides because 3x and 4x are on this, both together on the same side. We're just going to combine those together. So 3x plus 4x would be 7x. And then I'm just going to add 6 to both sides to get 126 on the right. So my last step would just be to divide. So I'm going to divide both sides by 7. And when you do that, you get your answer. X would equal 18. Now, the beautiful thing about algebra is you can always check your work. And so if you went back and checked this, you would be able to confirm that you do in fact have the right answer. So if I put 18 in here for x in the original equation, I would put it here, I would put it here. And when we do that, 18 minus 2 in that first fraction would be 16, and 16 divided by 4 would be 4. And in the second fraction, 18 divided by 3 would be 6, and 4 plus 6, sure enough, would be 10. So that checks out. So it's always good to be in the habit of checking your answers. All right, so why don't you guys go ahead and pause this video. I want you to write down this other equation, this guided practice problem. Please do, in fact, pause this video and try this one on your own, and hit play when you're ready to check to see if you've done it correctly. All right, let's see how you did. You should have started this one out the same way as the previous one. We're going to multiply everything by our common denominator. In this case, it would be 12 again, because 3, 4, and 2 all go into 12 evenly. So with this first one, when we take 3 times 12, I'm sorry, not 3 times 12, 3 goes into 12 4 times. So we would have 4 left over to multiply times the 2x plus 13. And then 4 goes into 12 3 times. So we would have 3 left over to multiply the numerator by x minus 13. And then lastly, 2 goes into 12 6 times. We'd have 6 left over to multiply times 15. So next I'm going to distribute each of these through. So when you do that, you would get 8x plus 4 times 13 would be 52. And then 3 times x would be 3x. 3 times negative 13 would be negative 39. And 6 times 15 would be 90. So again, we combine like terms. On the left side, I have 8x plus 3x, which is 11x. And 52 minus 39 is 13. So we'll have 11x plus 13 equals 90. So now if I solve this, this is just a simple two-step equation. So I would subtract 13 from both sides, giving me 11x equals 77. Divide both sides by 11, and I would get x equal 7. And if you went through and if you checked your work, you would end up getting 15 halves on the left and 15 halves on the right. So that would work out. All right, so next thing we're going to talk about is how do we solve inequalities involving fractions. Okay, so those were equations. These are inequalities. Some important things to make sure that you understand when working with inequalities. Make sure you get this in your notes, so probably pause the video so you can write down all of this. When solving an inequality, they're going to yield a solution set, meaning we're not just looking for a single solution like we did in the previous two examples. We're going to have a set of values. Using a number line is going to help you identify what that set's going to be. Remember, remember to flip the inequality anytime we multiply or divide by a negative number. All right, so let's look at this first one. So everything here, so I want to clear out the fractions just like we did before. Okay, so that's not going to change. If we ever clear out the fractions by multiplying by a negative, we want to remember that we would flip the inequality. But here we're going to multiply everything by, looks like 12 again. 3 goes into 12, 2 goes into 12, 4 and 3 obviously both go into 12. So we'll multiply everything by 12. So when I do that, we would have 3 goes into 12 4 times. We'd have 4 times x. And then for the next one, 2 goes into 12 6 times. So we would have plus 6 times 1, or just 6, is going to be greater than. And 4 goes into 12 3 times. We'd have 3 times x. And lastly, 3 goes into 12 4 times. And so we would just have 4 times 1, or 4. So I'm going to group everything together here. I'm going to get all my variables on one side and all the numbers on the other. So I'm going to subtract 3x from both sides. When I do that, 4x minus 3x is just a single x. And then I would subtract 6 from both sides. Subtracting 6 doesn't change the inequality, so it stays the greater than. But then we would have x is greater than negative 2. So if I were to graph this on a number line, if this is negative 2, we'd say our values for x are going to be bigger than negative 2. So that means we would say they start at negative 2 and they go towards infinity. So that would be our solution set. We want to be in the habit of writing our solution set in interval notation. That's what this is, instead of writing it just as inequalities. So why don't you guys try this one on your own? Again, if you ever have to multiply or divide by negative, remember to flip the inequality. So you might have to do that right off the bat on this one. So why don't you guys go ahead and try this one on your own. So just like before, pause the video and hit play when you're ready to check to see if you've done it correctly. All right. So for this one, you should have multiplied everything by negative 3. So by multiplying by negative 3, I like to circle that just to remind myself when I get to that point to flip the inequality. So in that first fraction, when I take into negative 3 into negative 3, I'm not left with anything. I'm left with just 2x minus 4 on the left. Again, we're going to flip that inequality, so it's going to be greater than or equal to now. And then 14, I'm going to multiply that times negative 3. And 14 times negative 3 would be negative 52. So now I just have to solve this inequality here. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. Then I'd have 2x is greater than or equal to negative 48. Now when I divide by 2, I'm dividing by a positive 2, so I do not flip the inequality. It would just stay greater than or equal to. And negative 48 divided by 2 would be negative 24. So again, we're saying that on a number line, if this is negative 24, our values are greater than or equal to negative 24. So we'd have a bracket at negative 24 saying that it's everything to the right. So it would go on towards infinity. All right. Let's move on now. Let's talk about what to do if we're solving equations involving quadratics. Now we've talked about solving quadratics before. Personally, my favorite method to use is I always try to look to see if I can factor it first. If I'm not sure, another way that you could do it is you could complete the square and factor it that way. Worst case scenario, you could always use a quadratic formula. So quadratic formula will always work, even if they're not factorable. So when in doubt, if you just want to use a quadratic formula, you can. I don't care which method you use. All I care is that you show your work. But let's look at this first one. So now this first one, we need to simplify this. This is not equal to 0, so we can't take and set each factor equal to 0 and solve it. We can't do that because it's not equal to 0. So instead, I have to simplify this by distributing the x through. So we would have 4x squared minus 27x equals 40. And I want to get rid of the 40 on the left. I want to get it all on one side. So I'm going to subtract 40 from both sides. I'm just going to write it like this. So now we have it like this. So if you wanted to, you could use a quadratic formula because it's set equal to 0 now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look to see if I can factor this. because like I said, that's always the easiest method, or maybe not always the easiest, but it's my preferred method. So the way that I would do this is, remember, this first term is not 1, so I'm going to multiply together the 4x squared and the negative 40. And when I do that, I get negative 160x squared. So I'm going to try to find two numbers that multiply together to be negative 160 that add together to be negative 27x. Now you might have to use a calculator for that. Okay, you might have to play around with this a little bit. The fact that they multiply together to be a negative means that one's going to be positive and one's going to be negative. And the fact that they add up to be a negative tells me that the bigger number is going to be the negative number. And so if you play around with it, if you try different factors, like I started out with 2 and did 2 and 80, and then I did 4 and 40, but then I tried 5 and I got 5 and 32, and 5x minus 32x would end up being negative 27x. So those would be the two factors. So the 4x squared, remember that stays a 4x squared. And that minus 27x, we're breaking that up into the 5x and the minus 32x. But then the minus 40 stays as it is. So now we're going to factor this by grouping. So in these first two terms, I can factor out an x, so we'd be left with 4x plus 5. Second two terms, since that first term's a negative, I have to factor a negative out, and both of those are divisible by 8. So I'm going to factor an 8 out, so then we'd have 4x plus 5 there as well. And so this would break down, this would factor down to be 4x plus 5 times x minus 8 equals 0. So now we can set each of these factors equal to 0 and solve them. So I would say 4x plus 5, I would set that equal to 0, x minus 8, I'd set that equal to 0. For this first one, I would subtract 5 and divide by 4, so I would get negative 5 fourths. And the second one, I would add 8 to both sides, and I would get x equals 8. So those would be my two solutions for that one, negative 5 fourths and 8. Let's try this next one together. So this next one's a little different. This next one, I'm going to group all the variables on one side, so I'm going to add 6x squared to both sides. So when I do that, I would get 3x squared plus 6x squared, so I'd end up with 9x squared on the left. And I'm going to add 8 to both sides, and so on the right, 17 plus 8 would be 25. Now this one's different. This one, I just have a single variable in it. So if I wanted to, I don't have to factor this one. I could solve this one really easy just by solving for x. Let me show you. I'm going to start by dividing both sides by 9. So I'd have x squared equals 25 divided by 9. Now that can't reduce, but I see that I have x squared equals 25 divided by 9. I have the x by itself. All I got to do now is just take the square root of both sides. Now remember, if you take the square root of both sides, how many solutions am I going to have? There's two things I could square, a positive and a negative, to get that answer. So my answer would be x equals plus or minus, and I could take the square root of both 25 and 9. The square root of 25 would be 5, and the square root of 9 would be 3. So anytime if you simplify, if you get all the variables on one side and you find that you only have one variable, and it's a square, even if it's a cubed, you can solve that very easily just by using roots. And so for this one, you get the variable by itself first, so don't take the square root of both sides until you get the variable by itself. And then the last step would be to take the square root of both sides, and then just remembering that if you take the square root of both sides, you're going to have two solutions, a plus and a minus. So we get plus or minus 5/3 there for that second example. All right, let's see how you're doing with this. Why don't you guys go ahead and work on these two problems. These are very similar to the problems that we were just looking at. So pause the video, get these in your notes, attempt them on your own, and hit play when you're ready to check to see if you've done them correctly. All right, so this first one is the one that requires a little bit extra work. So let's do this. Start with this one. So I'm going to distribute the x through. So when you do that, you get 4x squared minus 15x. And then I'm going to subtract 25 from both sides. Kill two birds with one stone there. So then we get 4x squared minus 15x minus 25 equals 0. If you do that in two separate steps, totally fine. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor this down. So I'm going to multiply together those first and last terms. And when I do that, I get negative 100x squared. And that middle term is negative 15x. So we're trying to find two numbers that multiply together to give us negative 100x squared that add together to be negative 15. And just like the previous one, since they multiply to be a negative, One's positive, one's negative, and since they add up to be a negative number, the bigger one's going to be negative. All right, so what numbers did you come up with? You should have came up with 5x and negative 20x. Because multiply those together, you get negative 100. And if you add those together, you get negative 15x. We're going to break that up. So the 4x squared stays a 4x squared. But that minus 15x, we're going to change to be a positive 5x minus 20x. If you had those in the other order, minus 20x plus 5x, it doesn't matter. You get the same answer in the long run. All right, so now let's group these together, the first two terms, the last two terms. So in the first two terms, I see you can factor out an x. So we're left with 4x plus 5. In the last two terms, I see that those are both divisible by 5, but since the first one's negative, we got to use a negative 5. So negative 20 divided by negative 5 would be a positive 4, so we'd have 4x, and negative 25 divided by negative 5 would be a positive 5. So since we have 4x plus 5 in parentheses for both those terms, that'd be one of our factors, and then x minus 5, what's outside of there, would be our other factor. And we're going to set those equal to 0 and solve. So I would say 4x plus 5, I would set that equal to 0. X minus 5, I would set that equal to 0. When I solve those, I would get negative, because I would subtract 5 and divide by 4, so I'd get negative 5/4. And for this one, I would just add 5 to both sides, so I get x equals 5. I didn't mention this before, but remember you could always check your answers, just like we've done earlier, to see that you got those right. And that's all you'd have to do for to check to see that you did it right. Okay, let's look at the last one. The last one here, we're going to add 10x squared to both sides. When you do that, on the left side, we would end up with 11x squared. Then I'm going to add 4 to both sides, so I get 11x squared equals 13. This one's not as nice as our previous one that we did, because when I divide by 11, I get x squared equals 13 over 11. And then we're going to take the square root of both sides. And remember, that's going to give us two solutions, a plus and a minus. So we would, but I can't take the square root of 13 or 11. So it would be the square root of, we'll just leave it as a fraction, 13/11. And that would be your answer for that second one. How'd you do? Hopefully you got those right. All right, there is one last problem that we're going to look at in this video, and that's how to solve equations involving multiple factors. Now this one's different from the ones that we were doing because we have a 1 out in front. Okay, so this is one of those where we don't have to break this up into 4 terms if you don't want to. If you did, you'd still get the same answer, but this is one where you could actually solve a little bit quicker. But you might recognize that, wait a minute, this is x to the 4th, it's not a square. Well, what that means is that when we go and break this up into 2 separate pieces, it's going to be, both our starting terms are going to be x squared, and I'll show you why here in just a second. But we're trying to find 2 numbers that multiply together to be positive 9, that add together to be negative 10. Well, if we have 2 numbers that multiply together to be a positive, but they add together to be a negative, it means that they're both negative numbers. And it's going to be negative 1 and negative 9, because negative 1 times negative 9 is positive 9, and negative 1 plus negative 9 is positive 10. So let's talk about why these starting terms have to be x squareds, because remember, if we multiply these together, we should be able to get the same thing that we had before. So I'm just going to do that quickly so you can see how this works. You don't always have to do this, I'm just illustrating a point here. So x squared times x squared, well, that's going to be x to the 4th is what we want as our starting term. X squared times negative 1, that would be negative x squared. Negative 9 times x squared would be negative 9x squared, and negative 9 times negative 1 would be a positive 1. So you see, when I combine like terms that end up with x to the 4th, here's my like terms. Those give me the negative 10x squared. And then, whoops, I don't know why I put 1 there. Negative 9 times negative 1 is a positive 9. And then our last term there would be a positive 9. So I'm just showing you that that's why we have to have x squareds. So that way when you multiply them together, you'd end up with x to the 4th there. Okay, so you might think that we're done. Well, remember, we also have what's called difference of squares. This is a difference of square, and this is a difference of squares. So x squared minus 1, that would break down to be x plus 1 times x minus 1. And the other one would break down to be x plus 3 times x minus 3. If you're wondering how I'm doing that, remember our difference of squares. If we have a squared minus b squared, that factors down to be a plus b times a minus b. In other words, take the square root of each of those values and then just put it in that format, a plus b, a minus b. So the square root of x squared is just x. In the second set, the square root of 9 is 3. So our a would be x, our b would be 3. So we'd have x plus 3, x minus 3. And these, again, would be equal to 0. I forgot to carry that 0 down. So now we're going to just set each of those equal to 0 and solve them. I'm not going to rewrite all 4 of those. You can see what's going to happen. If we set each of those equal to 0 and solve them, we would get x equals, so this one would yield a negative 1. This one would give us a positive 1. This would give us a negative 3. And this one would give us a positive 3. Or we could write it saying that we'd have plus or minus 1 and plus or minus 3 as our solutions. So that's how you would do one like that. You do have a problem like that in your assignment. All right, so that's it for this first video. So go ahead and you guys can start working on your assignment if you'd like. If you look on the calendar on Schoology, it'll tell you which ones to work on. And good luck as you work on that assignment.